Before this video gets started, I want to quickly mention that if you want to support the channel more directly, you can now become a channel member. If you're interested, you can click the join button below, where you'll be able to take a look at the benefits of becoming a member, and also see the badges and emojis you will receive. The history of many European nations has very much been one of unification of similar groups of people. Germany was once a mess of tiny duchies and a few larger kingdoms, and Italy used to consist of many city-states and kingdoms. These smaller entities, sharing close cultural and linguistic ties, were eventually unified and their languages standardized. But one place where this almost happened, yet failed, is Scandinavia. The countries of Denmark, Sweden, Norway, and to a lesser extent Iceland, share close cultural ties and have languages that are arguably more similar to each other than the various German dialects before unification. And in the 14th century, the most populous and influential kingdom here at that time, Denmark, had even managed to unify the region under the Kalmar Union. This union was created as a reaction to the growing presence of the Hanseatic League and Baltic trade, as the Scandinavians wanted to be able to compete with them, as well as protect their trade and influence in the region. But the union failed due to some frankly poor decisions by the Danish king, who slaughtered several Swedish nobles in the Stockholm bloodbath. This was part of a larger conflict within Sweden, between those in the aristocracy who were pro-union and pro-independence. If the Danish king had made better strategic moves to increase support among the Swedish nobles, not isolated Sweden as much, and of course not slaughtered pro-independence nobles, it is possible that they could have made the union last, and thus created a stronger, more unified kingdom further down the line. So, what would have happened if Denmark managed to keep the Kalmar Union together and created a unified Scandinavian nation and cultural identity which lasted till this day? That is what I will attempt to answer in this alternate history scenario. The history of Scandinavia as a unified entity began in 1397 with the formation of the Kalmar Union. The union was unstable and very decentralized in its early years, with an internal conflict within the aristocracy raging in Sweden between the pro-union and pro-independence factions. This conflict would come to an end in the late 1400s under the reign of King Christian I, where Denmark, along with Swedish unionists, would decisively defeat Sten Sture the Elder and his armies. From then on, the Kalmar Union would increasingly consolidate power and move towards creating a unified kingdom. The union would also focus more on Swedish interests in the east, in an attempt to solidify Swedish loyalty. They would defeat the Novgorod Republic in the late 1400s, while it was at war with the Grand Duchy of Moscow, thus solidifying Swedish and Norwegian claims to the sparsely populated north. Later in the mid-1500s, the Kalmar Union would also see a successful campaign against the Livonian Order, thus gaining territory in the Baltic region. In 1567 is when the Union would see full consolidation of the realm, with the writing of the Scandinavian Constitution and subsequent declaration of Scandinavian unity into one single kingdom. Following this official unification is also when Scandinavia would deal the final blow to the Hanseatic League, seizing the important trade cities of Lübeck and Hamburg and completely disbanding the league. Scandinavia would see itself grow from being a disunified bureaucratic mess consisting of 3 different realms into a well-organized kingdom and major power with complete domination over Baltic trade. But while Scandinavia was growing in power, so was the Duchy of Moscow, which had conquered its neighbors and established the Tsardom of Russia. But Russia would see a time of troubles in the early 1600s, where several kings and nobles would make a play for the Russian throne, including the Scandinavians, who attempted to put a Scandinavian duke on the Russian throne. This attempt failed, and the first Tsar of the Romanov dynasty was elected Tsar in Moscow. But as Scandinavia already controlled several forts in the west of Russia, the Russian Tsars signed a treaty with Scandinavia and ceded their Baltic coasts. This left Russia without any ports on the Baltic coast and increasingly reliant on its Arctic ports and to trade from Scandinavia. But it also connected Scandinavian lands in Finland with their Baltic territories and left them with practically no competition in the Baltic. While this was happening, Scandinavia had also been making a play for the New World, once discovered by Norseman Leif Erikson, but now rediscovered by Christopher Columbus, starting an age of colonialism where several European powers established trading outposts and conquered natives in search of great wealth. The Spanish were already well established on the continent, but now the English, French, and Scandinavians would also try their luck in the Americas, with Scandinavia founding the colonies of Greenland and Vinland, names given to these lands by Norse explorers centuries ago. In the 1600s, internal issues in the Holy Roman Empire, caused primarily by the rise of Protestantism, would lead to the 30 Years' War. Here Scandinavia would be a part of the anti-imperial alliance, which would eventually win in the middle of the century. Here Scandinavia would cede land in the north of the HRE, making the Scandinavian Empire more powerful than ever. This significant growth in Scandinavian power worried the Russians and Polish-Lithuanians, who alongside Prussia would declare war on Scandinavia in the year 1700, starting the Great Northern War. Scandinavia would perform surprisingly well against Russia and Poland-Lithuania, so despite expectedly losing the war, Scandinavia would keep most of its holdings, only really losing what it gained from the 30 Years' War to Prussia, which would turn out to be a formidable foe. One major consequence of this, however, was that the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth would be left significantly weakened, which would have consequences later in the century. Over in North America, the colonial powers had been expanding their colonies significantly. Scandinavia would have agreed to some concessions to the British as to avoid war and remain on good terms. Scandinavia at this time was undisputedly the second most powerful naval power in Europe, but it was still inferior to the British Royal Navy, and the Scandinavians knew this. France, however, a longtime rival of Britain, would instead come into conflict with them over a territorial dispute between the 13 colonies and French Louisiana. This conflict would spill over into Europe and become a 7-year-long war where Scandinavia would side with the British in the hopes that they could then keep their Vinland colony, which was right next to British North America. Britain and their allies would win in the end, reaffirming their dominance over North America and leaving them with control over everything south of the Great Lakes and Leif Erikson River. But this war was costly and would later lead to the American Revolution and following independence of their American colonies. Over in Europe by the 1790s, the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth had been slowly waning in power and would be partitioned between Scandinavia, Russia, Austria, and Prussia, expanding the Scandinavian Empire to what would be its territorial height on the European continent. But this empire would not last forever, and what would end this era of Scandinavian dominance in Europe is the Napoleonic Wars. Here Scandinavia would attempt to remain neutral, but this would prove to not be an option, as Napoleon wanted to put in place the continental system, where no powers in Europe would be allowed to trade with Britain. This would lead to Napoleon invading Scandinavia with help from its subdued Russian ally. Scandinavia would retreat from the Baltic region, holding off the Russians along the defendable peninsulas, while Napoleon would occupy Jutland and Scandinavia's North German holdings. Napoleon would not be able to cross the Great Belt, however, due to Scandinavian naval dominance. Eventually, the tides would turn, as Russia could simply not survive without trade from Scandinavia or the British, and this would result in them leaving the continental system and trading with the coalition powers through their newly acquired Baltic seaports. Napoleon would in response then launch an unsuccessful campaign against Russia, losing almost his entire army and dooming his French Empire and continental system. The war would leave Russia and Prussia in a much stronger position, and Scandinavia weakened, bringing an end to Scandinavian dominance in Eastern Europe and their complete monopoly on Baltic trade. Although Scandinavia was weakened in Europe, it had been expanding its colonies, and by the mid-1800s, what started as a few trading outposts in Asia had become the Scandinavian East Indies, which had grown considerably during this period, bringing much-needed wealth back to Scandinavia. But in Europe, Prussia had been exponentially growing in power and established the North German Confederation. Prussia was attempting to unify Germany, and to do this, Otto von Bismarck thought he needed to first defeat the French, as they would do anything in their power to avoid German unification, and thus the War of 1870 began. Scandinavia would side with the French, as they were worried that a strong unified Germany would attempt to conquer Holstein, a region of Scandinavia that was still home to a substantial German minority, despite centuries of Scandinavian immigration. To Scandinavia's surprise, the French would be soundly defeated, but the Scandinavians were able to hold off the Germans in southern Jutland. France and Scandinavia would both agree to sign a peace treaty, ceding Alsace-Lorraine and Holstein to Germany, leaving them both with ambitions of retaking their lands. Prussia would also unite Germany in the process, and tensions would rise in Europe for the coming decades as Germany would now tip the balance of powers in Europe, proving itself capable of taking on two other historically major European powers on its own. During this time of rising tensions in Europe, the European powers would also agree to split the African continent between them, beginning the scramble for Africa. Here Scandinavia would already have had some minor colonial holdings and trading outposts, but it would now be given the massive territory of the Congo, as a compromise between the great powers of France and Britain, who had the most significant grip on the continent. This acquisition would bring Scandinavia and its empire to its territorial peak, which would last until the Second World War. Just as Africa had been divided between the Europeans, tensions back in Europe would boil over, and in 1914, the Great War, or First World War, began. What started this conflict was the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand of Austria-Hungary. This would lead to Austria-Hungary declaring war on Serbia, which would pull in the Austro-Hungarian ally of Germany and the Serbian ally of Russia. Russia would then call in their ally of France, would in turn pull Scandinavia into the war due to them forming an alliance following the War of 1870. In the early stages of the war, Germany would invade through neutral Belgium to circumvent French defenses, making the British join the war as well. And of course, the British also had the ulterior motive of wanting to deny Germany complete dominance over mainland Europe. Germany would see initial success in the west and great success in the east, but in both eastern France and Jutland, things would come to a standstill, leading to years of costly trench warfare. Eventually, the tides would turn in the west, as the United States joined and American reinforcements arrived on the western front. This would also allow Scandinavia the opportunity to push into northern Holstein. Germany and Austria-Hungary would eventually surrender and face harsh punishments for causing the war. France and Scandinavia would also regain their lost territories from the War of 1870. The war left Germany humiliated and significantly weakened, which led to the rise of fascism in the nation. This would lead to another series of conflicts and German attempt at domination over Europe. In 1939, Germany would invade Poland along with the newly established USSR, leading to the Western allies of France and Britain declaring war on Germany. This time around, Scandinavia was neutral and attempted to stay out of the conflict, but due to Germany wanting complete dominance over the European mainland and fearing an allied invasion from the north, they invaded Scandinavia in 1940. Their blitzkrieg strategy, along with superior air power and heavy bombardment of the Scandinavian fleet, would allow the Germans to quickly and efficiently invade southern Scandinavia. Within the first week, the region of Denmark would be under German occupation, and within 2 weeks, much of Sweden and Norway would be as well. But the Scandinavians would hold off the Germans for long enough to evacuate the royal family and government out of Copenhagen and over to Vinland via ports behind the front lines up in Nordland. Although the Germans would see great success in the early stages of the invasion, this, along with the later invasion of the USSR, would prove to be a crucial mistake on the part of the Germans. The Scandinavian government, which had fled to Vinland, would still be able to send out orders and support the war effort. While Germany swiftly took over France and the Low Countries, they would get bogged down in the Norwegian mountains and Swedish forests. In occupied territories, the Germans would face fierce resistance and guerrilla tactics. Meanwhile, Scandinavia would retain control of Finland and most of Nordland, allowing the influx of troops and resources through their northern ports. Scandinavia would prove crucial in the late stages of the war, when the Soviets turned the tide in the east and the Allies planned their invasions in the west. Allied troops, among them many Vinlanders, would be sent to Normandy, Italy, and Scandinavia, spreading the Germans thin as they're forced to hold off 4 fronts at once. France and Scandinavia would eventually be fully liberated, and the Western Allied powers would meet the Soviets at the Oder River. The USSR would set up puppet governments across Eastern Europe, ceding occupied Pomerania and Silesia to Poland. Meanwhile, the Western Allied powers would jointly occupy Germany. This would lead to the Cold War, where the USSR and United States would compete for dominance all over the world. Here, Scandinavia would join NATO and support the Americans. During the Cold War, the European powers would also start a period of decolonization, partially due to the cost of the war being so great that many could not maintain their colonies any longer. Scandinavia would already have lost the Scandinavian East Indies due to them declaring independence after the Japanese surrendered, but it would slowly throughout the 1900s grant its colonies across the world their independence, including Vinland, which would be given the territory of Greenland as well. And this is just about where we are today. The USSR would fall in the 90s, leaving Russia weaker. Today China is on the rise in Asia, and Scandinavia is a key member of NATO, and just an overall major economic and military power in Europe. But that's all for now. I'll go into much more detail with Scandinavia today in the next episode, so stay tuned for that. Thanks for watching, and don't forget to subscribe and hit the bell button if you want to see more content like this in the future. See you around.